So I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Washington Post. I want to thank Sarah Bloomfield for that wonderful introduction. Just to repeat, we have an opportunity this morning to hear about the fruits of a year spent studying the question of how the responsibility to protect can become more meaningful and powerful in the world. It was sponsored by three wonderful organizations. I want to repeat them because the work they do is so important: the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Brookings Institution, and the Holocaust Museum. I want to turn to the two co-chairs of the working group who guided this study, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Ambassador Rich Williamson, who was America's special envoy to the Sudan during the presidency of George W. Bush and has a distinguished record beyond that, and ask each of them, starting with Ambassador Williamson, to give this audience a sense of what, after a year of study, they have concluded about how to make this R2P not just a doctrine, but a reality and a basis for action in the world. So, Ambassador Williamson, please start.
Thank you, David. First, I want to thank those of you who are interested in coming here today. I want to thank the three institutions, especially the Holocaust Museum and Mike Abramowitz, for being so helpful. I especially want to thank my friend and colleague, Madeleine Albright, who's been a terrific collaborator on this and other things. I just want to take a slight step back. The United States, like other countries, first should be driven by a desire for their own national security. That should be the dominant claimant. Then other vital interests, many of them economic. But what's made the United States different was not only that it was founded on a belief in human rights, but in the last 100 years we've allowed it to animate our foreign policy. And America's best when it allows that to happen, and our interests are served and the world's more secure. When I was up in New York as ambassador for special political affairs, I dealt with peacekeeping and became familiar with what was going on in the Eastern Congo and in Sudan, and was continually shocked about the capacity of man's inhumanity to man. Then when I was special envoy to Sudan, I spent time in Darfur and Chad and South Sudan, visiting every time with refugees who'd gone through horrific experiences. I came to believe that what President Clinton and Secretary Albright did in responding to the crisis and ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo was important not only for that region, for Europe, but for the United States and the world. When President Bush joined the consensus for the responsibility to protect in 2005, the United States agreed to this concept, and I felt it was valuable to try to help strengthen it, which is why I sought out Madeleine to join me in this effort. The responsibility to protect isn't the answer, but hopefully it can contribute by being an emerging norm that gains greater acceptances by governments, to make it easier for the decision makers to do something early when these crises break out. Anyone who's had the privilege and honor of being in the Situation Room with the President wrestling with these sorts of decisions know they're always tough. They're case by case. You can't do everything, but just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you shouldn't do some things. And the responsibility to protect and the implementation of the Genocide Prevention Task Force that Madeleine chaired with Secretary Cohen try to lay out steps that can be taken to make it easier to get early notice, to make a difference. So I think that's why we both believe in R2P, all three pillars, trying to get the United States to have the political will to help lead with others to stop atrocity crimes before they become too horrific and the death, despair, and agony becomes too great.
Secretary Albright.
Sarah mentioned that it's about to be 100 years since the beginning of World War I. And she quoted Woodrow Wilson. I am a person that was born in Czechoslovakia, a country that came into existence because of Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points and the real ideas of self-determination and that people should live in their own sovereign countries. I left Czechoslovakia during World War II and came to the United States when the communists took over. And I wrote a book about what really happened in terms of the beginnings of World War II and what were the warning signs. And one could say, nobody sitting in this room, however, would say it, is that we didn't know what was happening during the Holocaust. We now know everything that's going on everywhere as a result of information technology and our capability of being more knowledgeable about the internal affairs of other countries. And while what happened with Czechoslovakia from a war-weary England and France led Neville Chamberlain to say, why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names? And that is something that I think echoes in our own approach as we look at the various issues that are out there in the world, trying to figure out when we do know what is going on somewhere, whether we should care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names, and what is the responsibility of the international community, having kept in mind very much what Rich said about what our national security issues are. Is there a way that the international community that was not able to prevent World War I and World War II, whether there's something that can be done now to protect those and prevent the kinds of things that lead to examples of never again. So this is a very practical approach. We do understand that it's a difficult concept, and we're going to talk about that. And one of the reasons that we wrote the report, and we're so pleased that everybody's here, I'm really blown away by the number of people that are here, because we think it's not a fully understood concept that needs to be seen as part of an international norm that is in the process of evolving, and having all of you understand it and question us will, we hope, lead to the evolution and understanding of the concept. And David, thank you very, very much for being here with us. You and I talked about this, and I'm very pleased that you respected is an understatement when one talks about what you are able to do in your writings. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to just stay with the report for a minute so that we give the audience a little flavor of what's new in it. And I want to ask you about two particular aspects that your working group ended up recommending as a way to make these three pillars on which R2P is based. If you don't know the literature, the three pillars are: first, every state has a duty to protect its people from genocide, ethnic cleansing. Second, the international community has a responsibility to assist states in doing this. And third, in the absence of the first two, countries have to be ready to take action under the Charter. And this report says we need to implement those three pillars more aggressively. But there are two things that caught my eye in your report, and I want to ask you about them. Maybe each of you could comment on one. One is greater use of the International Criminal Court, the international organization of legal action that can take, that can move early against specific people, so that you don't get to this stage where a wholesale military intervention is required. And second, the use of technology, the use of these modern technologies that Secretary Albright mentioned to give early warning of disasters that are taking place that might not be understood, and make those visible to you. And maybe each of you could briefly talk about those two innovative ideas. And Master Williamson, maybe you could start with the ICC, and Secretary Albright talk a minute about monitoring.
To me, the issue on the ICC is the issue of accountability. I think it's very important, and it's something in the last 7 years that the United States has taken some leadership in. The United States took the lead in forming the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials after they effectively held some of the worst criminals to account for those atrocities. There was a presumption that this would continue. It got lost. For example, after the Cambodian killing fields, no one discussed the need for that. But then as the 20th century, the most brutal, the most victims in mankind's history, the pace picked up in the 1990s with Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo. The United States took the lead in helping form the ICTY, ICTR, also with the Sierra Leone Special Court and others. The ICC is another manifestation. The last three administrations, 2 Democrat, 1 Republican, no one sent the ICC up for ratification. There are problems with it. But as our report says, it also is a vehicle that sometimes can be very useful to try to get accountability. The U.S. allowed the referral of Darfur to go to the ICC, contributed intelligence to strengthen the case. Later, when the African Union was making an effort for a so-called Article 16 to stop that, the U.S. went out with President Bush's authority to say, we'll veto it, and that faded away. So I think trying to continue to develop the principle of accountability is important, because in the end, most of these conflicts are not spontaneous combustion. They're the result of powerful people either trying to stay in power or get to power and willing to open the gates of hell to do that. Will accountability change it? Maybe some cases. It'll make it a more expensive decision. And that's good, just like the R2P concept is not an answer, but hopefully is a step forward to ending these type of terrible situations.
Secretary Albright, you want to talk a little bit about monitoring?
Well, first of all, let me just say on the accountability, it's a very essential point. But the other is, frankly, that we've talked about, is that the war crimes tribunals as well as the ICC is a way to have individual guilt assigned and collective guilt expunged, which then makes it possible for people to deal with each other. So there are various parts of it, and I think that while it's not perfect, and there are a number of different ways that people are looking at whether it's an inducement for people to behave well or actually a way for them not to, because there's no immunity, and so anything that is new has its issues as it gets worked out. But I'm very glad that there has been an evolution kind of in this whole concept of international norms on it. The monitoring is interesting because first of all, none of this can work without the cooperation of non-governmental organizations that are on the ground that can really help to provide information very quickly about what is going on. What we do now have, the technology is a two-edged sword in many ways in terms of our new societies. In this particular venue, I think it is a very positive one, because with people, first of all, are able to transmit information very quickly through mobile phones, of which there are many more than landlines in the developing world, and also with photographs that they can take, all the various video equipment that even the simplest places have, and the monitoring makes a big difference, because then it isn't just kind of hearsay, but allows people to know what is going on. It does create a need to act, however. That may be, I think from the perspective of this report, is positive, but there are those in some places who would prefer not to know. But I do think that there has been an entirely new way of knowing what is going on.
Should readers of your report begin thinking about a world where we have blue surveillance drones over key crisis areas, monitoring the possibility of terrible mass atrocities and getting word to people who can act?
We actually do over Mali. That's what's going on. And I happen to think that if they're used for surveillance, I think is a very important part of this. And I do think the more we know, the more equipped we are. We still come down to the question of then what. But I do think also if people begin to recognize that they are being watched, I think that that in itself may be also a help in preventing.
Yeah, and we've seen George Clooney and John Prendergast's effort with satellites to keep the Sudan border region viewed, and it's very helpful, I think, especially just to refer to Sudan, where you've got governments, sometimes both in Juba and Khartoum, that won't let international NGOs go there or the UN, so you don't have on-the-ground observers. So yeah, it's an additional tool to be used.
So I want to turn to the really difficult question that R2P discussions raise, and that is whether and how to act in difficult situations. And we might do that by just looking at developments since 2005, when the R2P concept was endorsed at a UN World Summit. And since then, we've had atrocities in Darfur, in Sri Lanka, in Libya, which we'll talk about more in a minute, and most notably recently in Syria. And these have all been difficult problems for the international community to respond to in a decisive way that would stop the atrocities. They're tests of R2P, but you'd have to say that they haven't been successful so far. So let me ask you to address those tough questions that we're facing in our real world and offer some thoughts about them. Secretary Albright, you want to begin?
Well, I think what is important is to go back to, as you described, the 3 pillars, because I think that people automatically think that we're going to militarily intervene somewhere. The military intervention part is the last step, not the first steps. And I think that the areas that have been the most difficult are the ones where not enough attention has been paid early on. Nobody can speak about Darfur better than Rich Williamson, and I think that is partially a lack of recognition of various elements on the ground, including desertification, movement of a lot of refugees. So I think that we have not seen the early signs. Sri Lanka has been a very long, ongoing, complicated issue where we haven't been able to get any purchase over either side, frankly, whether it's the Tamils or whether it's the government or trying to figure out how to get at it. Where we have been successful, and I think it's interesting in terms of Kenya, where in the set of elections that took place in 2008 led to a lot of violence, and then we were able to figure out how to get some international action in there to try to not only diffuse the violence, but also set up a procedure which allowed the next elections and had an international negotiator. Kofi Annan went in order to do a lot of diplomatic work, and then worked in order to not have this happen again. The same is in Cote d'Ivoire, where, in fact, the person that was elected couldn't take office. The guy that was the incumbent didn't want to leave. Again, there was international attention to these areas ahead of time and did not require an on-the-ground intervention. And so one of the things that we wanted to point to as success stories are those where the first 2 pillars are used or looked at, and the ones that are failures is where you haven't been able to get in early enough or haven't seen the signs early enough, which leads to this issue of the Atrocities Prevention Board that does, in fact, have set up a system within our government where some early warning systems then get transmitted through our government and then into the international community.
Pastor?
Thank you. I'll just reinforce some of what Secretary Albright said. I think one of the difficulties with people looking at the responsibility to protect is the assumption that you'll have robust action right away. And as we try to emphasize, just like the U.S., to use Secretary Albright's words, has a large foreign policy toolbox, there's a large toolbox of what can be done to respond to these type of crises. And the earlier intervention is both the cheapest and least kinetic. And Kofi's role in brokering the post-election with Redingo and others was a good example of it. Cote d'Ivoire, a good example of it. I think Libya has a whole bunch of lessons to be teased out. But as you note, there continues to be a genocide in slow motion in Sudan. There are terrible atrocities in Syria, and I'd rather say that just emphasizes why those of us who believe that it's both in our security interest and consistent with our values to stop these spreading atrocities need things like the Atrocity Prevention Board, need things like the commitment of Congress, need things like organizing the bureaucracy of the U.S. government better to respond, and working, most importantly, with international partners to help us. The real lesson there is just we have to do better, and it's going to take a while, but progress has been made, I believe.
I just want to push a little bit harder on the question of Syria, because that's taking place before the world's eyes right now. We have what appear to be documented allegations of the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations. We have allegations by the government of atrocities committed by the rebels. We have a situation in which the violence, the loss of life, potential dissolution of the country move forward every day, and despite heroic efforts by Kofi Annan and his successor Lakhdar Brahimi as the international community's representatives, we have no apparent movement toward any diplomatic resolution. And I just would say, how should the R2P community view this, not simply the terrible bloodshed, but the political difficulty of dealing with it?
Well, I do think it is obviously the most difficult situation that is out there at the moment, and decision makers are, in fact, wrestling with some solution. I have to say, I'm trying in my own mind to figure out how we got there, and I do think that a lot of it has to do with what happened in the Arab world generally. And if I might say, last winter I was in a meeting, I was having a public discussion with an Arab, and I said it's the winter, so we can't talk about the Arab Spring. We call it the awakening. And he got furious at me, and he said, that is such an insult. The Arabs haven't been asleep all this time. And I said, so what would you call it? And he said, Arab troubles. And I said, well, what about Arab opportunities? So just kind of those four phrases indicate the different thinking about it. And I'm not trying to obfuscate here, but I think basically, for whatever reasons, we didn't fully understand what was happening across the Arab world. That did come as a surprise. I think that needs to be looked at with some clarity and real objective approach to it. But I believe that what happened in Syria is a part of that. Having met both Hafez Assad, the father, who was nicknamed the lion but was more like a mule, and his son Bashar Assad, for whom, when I met him, I always thought that 1 and 1 made 2, but 2 and 2 never made 4. So kind of trying to figure out what they were doing. And so there was that issue. And then I think, frankly, people's minds were somewhere else, and were not, if I might say so, it's very hard as a former decision maker to criticize those in office, but basically whether not enough attention was paid. I think that part of the issue here, and this is the difficulty of R2P, is to analyze whom you're going to help, who are the people, and part of it has to do with the pillars again, because it is the responsibility of a leader of his country, it's usually his, to, in fact, protect the people in that country. That is the responsibility, to care about the people, the territory, and the way of life. So the opposite is happening in Syria. And so then I do think that the international community, not the United States, but the international community as a whole, has really failed in trying to find the right tools to deal with it. And the U.S. is not the only member of the international community. And that leads to one of the major issues with R2P that I think we have to recognize. And that is that it requires the approval of the Security Council. And having been there and done that on Kosovo, where it was clear that the Security Council, that the Russians were going to veto that, we took it out of that cul-de-sac and put it with NATO. And so I do believe that R2P is a very, very good international community approach. But personally, I never believe we should get stuck in a cul-de-sac.
That's well said. Ambassador?
Thank you. These are really tough decisions, made more difficult by the fatigue in the American public as a result of overreach from the Bush administration and the poor events in post-conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. I would have wished we'd been more leaning in on Syria. But if I could, I think one of the lessons of Syria is when you don't act, the cost. There's been a bleed with 600,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan, a critical ally, where the king was already suffering with other issues because of the Arab Spring. There's been a bleed with refugees into Turkey in 2 instances where there actually were missiles fired into our NATO ally, where we have certain treaty commitments if it gets out of hand. Lebanon has been affected, the Hezbollah's involved. Israel is threatened. It's become a proxy war for a rising Shia Tehran against the Sunni states, the Gulf states that are friends and allies, and the casualties have gone up. President Obama here at the Holocaust Museum in April discussed how genocide and ethnic cleansing are a national security threat. I think we're seeing that today. Hopefully it'll inform smarter people to think through this, and also as they weigh difficult decisions, keep that in mind, because the costs in Syria are tragic for the over 100,000 people who've died and even more who have been wounded. It's a tragedy that's going to be ongoing for a long time and probably a functioning failed state for a while. But it's a tragedy because of U.S. interests that have been compromised and challenged and may yet force us to take action that'll be more expensive than if we'd begun a long time ago.
Could I just add, I think that the points that Rich made about being tired, and I refer back to my opening statement, the British and French were exhausted from World War I. And they had lost a whole generation of young people. Their budget was a mess. Their military infrastructure was questioned. And Neville Chamberlain decided that, in fact, he would do anything for peace. And they made a deal over the heads of the Czechoslovaks with the Germans and Italians, and that country was sold down the river. And I think that we need to recognize, and Rich said it, is we are tired from the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And people feel that we have not paid enough attention to things in this country, which I happen to believe. And the question then is, how do we have a national discussion about this? Are we, in fact, in danger of what I've called the ink blot spread of Syria and its longer-term effect on our strategic interests, or do we, in fact, legitimately spend a lot of time thinking about what is going on in this country? And so I return on the following thing, which is President Clinton said it first, and I said it so often it became identified with me. We are the indispensable nation, which we said at a time that Americans were also tired from the Gulf War and too many years of not paying attention to the United States. There is nothing in the definition of indispensable that says alone. It just means the United States needs to be engaged. And I think, and I deliberately said, the international community has failed on this. It is the United States needs to be a part of this, but we do not have to respond to this all alone. And R2P is not just America in there. And therefore, we need to do more in terms of recognizing what the problems are and that it's an international responsibility. And that is where I think we need more action. And we need to have a discussion in the United States about what our national interests really are.
There's a big takeaway in what you both just said, that war weariness does not absolve countries' moral responsibility to act. I want to turn to a question that I think is rarely raised in discussions of R2P, but is one that's interested me for some years. And I'm going to characterize it as the moral hazard problem that goes along with an international commitment that there's a responsibility to protect. And by that, what I mean is there's something that I sometimes call the power of the weak. And by that, I mean the ability to start conflicts that you can't finish, hoping, believing that the International Committee will come to your rescue when you're at death's door. We've seen bits of this in many countries, as you know, and I want to ask you how you think sensible people involved in the R2 debate should deal with this question to make sure that this international commitment isn't taken by people to do things that if they had to be entirely responsible for themselves and their communities, they might not undertake. Ambassador Williamson?
Well, especially, as you know, there's been a great deal written about the events that led up to NATO's intervention in Kosovo in that context with the Muslim community and the sort of Christian community. I think that's, you see that in a number of UN peacekeeping operations, slightly different than the initiation of atrocity crimes. But it is a challenge. It's case by case. It's difficult. There's no one size fits all. I remember Hammarskjöld once wrote, when he was asked about UN peacekeeping, if we should have a permanent force, and he said, well, the challenges are so different case by case, you need to make each one tailor-made. So I don't think you can come out with a simple rule of how to handle it, but it's something decision makers have to be aware of. And frankly, the U.S. has a particular responsibility. When I was sitting in the Security Council and everybody would talk about, and I'm sure Madeleine had this, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, I'd raise my hand and say, we? Because others were volunteering, the only country that had the power for lift and other things to make it happen. So there are unique responsibilities and opportunities with our status. But I don't think you can have a rule that'll fit all. You've got to be aware of it. You've got to be aware of the best way to intervene. You've got to be aware of the need to have other countries involved with you. You need to be aware of the broad participation. But sure, one of the factors is to the extent in some circumstances you might have political minorities, not ethnic minorities, political minorities who see initiating violence as a way to get the international community to enhance their situation. And let me just say, finally, we see that in Syria, where when there's talk of a conference, people try to change the facts on the ground and commit even more intense atrocities to enhance their political position. It's just a reality that decision makers have to be aware of, and the United States has a particular attentiveness if we're going to be effective.
Secretary Albright, what would you say to someone, a political minority that starts a fight they can't finish? Is there thought you have on that?
Well, we've obviously all kind of thought about this, one, when we had to deal with it, and then in a more thoughtful academic way. Let me just say that what I find interesting, and Rich has pointed out a lot of the issues, is part of what makes a ethnic group or minority fight. Normally, there's something that they have been deprived of within the nation state that they're in. But also, then there becomes a dynamic within the group itself as to who's tougher, who is really standing up, who's somebody, a compromiser, whatever. I think that's the hardest part. And I can only tell you, you mentioned Kosovo. The time that I spent in Rambouillet dealing with the Kosovo fighters, one of whom is now the Prime Minister of Kosovo, Hashim Thaçi, and part of it was the extent to which he was willing to make a compromise on something, but some of the other people would say, no, you're just giving in. So the question is, and I don't know whether this is at all possible, is whether there is a bit of a bargain before you ever begin to support X in saying, I will support you, or we will, the international community, but the price of the support is that when you've won, you will actually not do the same thing to the people you've just defeated. And while we're speaking of Kosovo, I think, they like me there,
We like you here, too.
There is a whole generation of little girls called Madeleine, but the bottom line is that I spent a lot of time telling the Serbs what they couldn't do to the Kosovars. I have been back to Pristina, and what is interesting, the first time when I went initially during the bad period, what you saw were the Orthodox churches that were doing well, and the Muslim churches that were surrounded, the mosques that were surrounded by barbed wire and not. When I went back to Pristina, the opposite was true. And I said to them, this is impossible. I spoke in front of the National Assembly and said, you cannot do to the Serbs what they did to you. The question is whether one could have some kind of a reconciliation discussion before we ever support it. I don't know whether it's possible, because the dynamics that you talk about, Rich, of somebody for political reasons has to be tougher. And what I regret about Syria is that because it's taken long, the most extremist factions in many ways now are able to say, look, nobody helped us. And so that is the issue, but easier to talk about in theory than practice.
Interestingly, the main message our Deputy Secretary of State, William Burns, seems to have delivered on his recent trip to Cairo to the new ruling regime is the need for inclusiveness. Don't try to push the Muslim Brotherhood, into prison, underground, out of politics. Be inclusive. I want to conclude with one question, and then we're going to turn to the audience for your questions, so be thinking. And that is what in some ways is a great success for the R2P doctrine, but in other ways illustrates its limits, and that's Libya. And I just like to ask each of you to comment on Libya, both in the sense that people who were on the verge of annihilation in Benghazi were saved because of intervention, yes, but because there wasn't a responsibility to rebuild built into this doctrine adequately. From every account that I hear and read, Libya is really a mess. I mean, security and normal life just don't exist there now. So help us to think about Libya, both as a success and as a challenge.
Libya was fascinating for many reasons. Among them being it was the first time in the Security Council they actually invoked the words responsibility to protect in a resolution to dealing with this crisis, and then voted to authorize an intervention. Two, we learned or relearned both the effectiveness and limits of our NATO allies in carrying certain things out. But another thing I think we've learned is that in the calculations of getting involved, part of it has to be the post-conflict situation. And whether we're looking at Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya, we shouldn't give ourselves very good grades. And you can't come in and walk away and expect magically a society that's been torn apart, or in the case of Libya, balkanized for over 30 years. Even their military, down to platoons, were by tribes, never integrated, no civil society, to all of a sudden find a reconciliation. And I think, we have to keep learning and getting better. And one of the things I take out of Libya is, in addition to the serious discussions and deliberations where the president decided to go forward in March of 2011, I think it was, or 10, to support bombing. There probably should have been more discussion of the responsibility when the change happens, and hopefully working with local players, the United States and others can help them to start taking a path toward reconciliation. The division, the balkanization between Benghazi and Tripoli that's been there for centuries is more acute. The violence out in the oil area to the east is worse, and we've had instances in the last 2 months where there have been demonstrations and violence and militias taking over even government buildings in Tripoli. Getting rid of Mr. Gaddafi was not the end story. It was just the end of a chapter, and we should have stayed more engaged.
I think that it is fair to say that we live in an unbelievably complicated world where easy answers do not come, and the bottom line is the Libya issue did come up during our discussions, and we asked each other, was it going to help the R2P concept or hurt it? Because it really was the first time, as Rich said, that it was included in a resolution. I hope the message that comes out of this discussion is that this is just one way that we and all of the international community is trying to look at some kind of tools to help solve increasingly difficult situations. We are living in an entirely different world than the kind I grew up in, and the nation-state aspect is more complicated, the existence of a variety of ethnic groups, the different tools that are available. And I also think it is much easier to sit here representing no one than myself than to actually try to deal with these issues. Because what happens, and both Rich and I have been in the Situation Room, as far as I know you haven't, is that basically you sit there and you put forward issues and argue, is this good or bad? What happens often is there are so many people that can tell you why not to do something, because this will be this and that will be that then you don't do anything. And if you're the United States, you're damned if you do or damned if you don't. And I think that the question is you have to do case by case and the doability aspect of it. And you have to think about the unintended consequences of either the decisions you make or the ones you do not. There is no president that ever gets a clean slate. There are the carryovers on it. And I can assure you that whether I agree with them or not, there is nobody that sits in their offices trying to make stupid decisions. They are trying to look at what the various aspects are, and you do get kind of dragged down by saying, we'll go in there, but it's going to take $1 zillion, and it will take many years, and you still will not have accomplished anything. If there is ever any lesson that I learned, however, we cannot be our normal Americans of saying, done it, been there, over. It is not true in the Balkans. It is not true anywhere. And I think that we do need to understand that there is a commitment after whatever. So that would be, and that the R2P exercise is one of trying to get our heads around whether there is some new way of dealing with this.